Welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. Going to talk a little bit about some things I've talked about recently on the show, on the political front. I've had Ted Poe on, I guess it was the last part of last week. Is that right, Sigmund? And, Ted Poe's, we're both ACU alums, and so we share that in common, and I consider him a friend of the program. And, when we see each other, we're always glad to see each other. But I got to tell you, I found my conversation with him very disheartening that I had with him here, last week. And we had him on for quite a while. We had him, we did a long segment with him because really I wanted him to really clarify himself. I want to give him plenty of opportunity to clarify himself. But I was disappointed with that. And I got Sigmund here. Sigmund Kramer is joining me for this. What was your thoughts on that whole conversation?
It was like he was holding back. You know what he was trying to be? A senator, a U.S. senator.
Right.
And instead of his typical, feisty self, I mean, he's a feisty member of the United States House of Representatives.
Yeah, he is.
And he's a fighting, kind of a guy here in Texas. He's a fighting mad kind of a representative typically.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it surprised me that he held back and that he was playing coy, and really it was like he was dodging. He did not want to, didn't want to criticize as much as we would think he normally would. So it was. I know it sparked a sense in you that the Republicans are pretty much toast if someone with as much, fiery reputation as Ted Poe is kind of being milquetoast.
He was totally milquetoast. It was very. I guess it was great if I was talking to John Boehner, but, it was supposed to be Ted Poe.
You'd expect that from John Boehner.
That's exactly who he sounded like,
or
actually.
John McCain.
Yeah. That's who he sounded like, was like a Boehner. Let's be reasonable. How do you be reasonable with a government like this, And then he articulates all the things that the executive branch has done, or hasn't done, to hold itself accountable. And I'm like going, so when the executive branch doesn't hold itself accountable, who's left to hold it accountable? The judges aren't holding him accountable. So who holds him accountable? Well, it seems like to me, regardless of what the Senate does, the House has a responsibility.
Here's the thing. I honestly believe that Ted Poe and a lot of the Republicans, they're 1/3 of the executive. I mean,
Of the checks and balances.
But they're 1/3, and actually they're 1/2 of 1/3 because the Senate is still held by Democrats.
Right.
And so you got the White House, the executive branch is held by Democrats. You've got 1/2 of the Congress is held by Democrats, and then you've got the Supreme Court, which is evenly divided as well.
Apparently.
And so I think his point is, look, we're a very small portion of this whole pie, and we don't have very much authority because Republicans are tired of getting blamed for everything. I think he's in a defensive mode, and so he's not going after Obama at all like he should, because he's taking that Republican line of, hey, we don't have any power. If you want us to have power, you got to vote us in greater numbers. And November 4th is coming up, by the way, so why don't you go do that? Give us the Senate, give us greater numbers in the House, and then maybe we have some room to talk.
But he made it clear he's not going to reward the voters with that. He made it perfectly clear. It was very, very. He really didn't give a very strong reason why we should vote Republican.
No, he didn't. Like I said, it was.
And for a lot of offices, by the way, I'm voting Libertarian. I'm simply voting Libertarian until this, and I'll vote for Ted Poe. He is my congressman. I'll vote for him again. A lot of it has to do with the relationship. A lot of it has to do with the fact that, in the balance, he's a good representative. But there's certain offices I will be voting Libertarian rather than the GOP candidate.
Everyone
simply because I want to send a message to this GOP. They need to get its stuff together.
Everyone has to vote their conscience. I'm kind of doing it from a different perspective. I'm playing a game because, to me, politics is a game. And so if I vote for Libertarian and he has absolutely no chance of winning, then what I feel like I've done is really given a greater chance to the Democrat to win the office. Now, in certain
if these
states,
races were close, I would vote Republican.
Yeah, and I was
but
gonna
they're
say,
not. The ones I'm voting for are 10% leads. They're gonna vote. They're gonna win. But how do you send a message to them?
Right. I would pick up the phone, or I would write a letter, or
that
send
really
an email.
impresses them. I worked in constituent relations with a U.S. senator who actually cared more than most, but that doesn't really influence them very much. The vast majority could care less, especially if they gotten reelected.
Yeah.
They could care less. The rubber meets the road when they start feeling threatened politically.
Well, then, unfortunately, that's all tied into pocketbook. And so if they're not getting money, and see, this whole thing is so, unfortunately, we're all being bamboozled by the system, because even if you withhold funds from, say, the RNC, or you withhold funds from your local representative, they manage to get the funds anyway, somewhere, either from millionaire donors or whatever. They always have enough money to run for office again, right? So it's really hard to hold them accountable in this day and age. It really is.
You
and it's very frustrating. Well, you're frustrated. You wanted to do this segment because you were disheartened, you said, and by Ted Poe, who's, like you said, typically one of the good guys, one of the ones who really works hard and fights hard for Texas and for America. And so it is disheartening.
Make your job easy. Go to HuffingtonPost.com, put in Kevin Price in the search engine, and just click that link, and it's the very first article. Read the article, listen to the interview. There's a link to the interview there. Give me your food for thought. I'd love to get your feedback. Do you want to mention we're also working on this story about the mayor snooping into sermons here in town? We're going to be doing an interview about that here shortly. And we were one of the very first programs to actually talk about it here in the Houston area, and I'm delighted we covered that.
If not the first to actually have an in-depth conversation about it,
Yep.
Even though it was just breaking.
And
I think that you'll see that we'll have some really good guests to talk about it.
In fact, it was so early in the process that we weren't even sure the validity of it. That's how early the process was.
Right.
Since then, we have proven that it's very true. The mayor has now responded, and we'll be talking about that, I'm sure, next week. Coming up next, much more for you right here on The Price of Business.